Good morning, and welcome to the Black Mesa Transit System.
Oh look, another gamer on the internet writing a video essay about Half-Life, adding his freshman take to a conversation that's almost as old as he is. Okay, sure, I was in preschool when the first game came out, but my brain works now. Kinda. Look, I've been gaming for most of my life. I'm fairly good at it, and my tastes have expanded over the years to where I can appreciate quality when I see it. I should be able to answer the question that pops up around every classic of the medium. Does Half-Life hold up? I mean, just by looking at it, you can already tell it's old. I'm playing with the retrofitted HD models, and the game still looks like it was made in the late 90s. AAA games have moved so far beyond these ancient polygons that the blocky 3D visuals have become the new retro, the countercultural response to aggressive visual modernization. Only these new games still aim for greater speed and smoother handling, no longer enthralled by what was, at the time, mind-blowing design. But even players who relish the classic look will still grind their teeth whenever they climb a ladder, jump across a series of precarious platforms, or guide a cart along a fixed railway. There's a lot of aggravating business that Half-Life fans will tolerate to get to the parts they really like. The shooting, for example, hasn't really been tarnished by the passage of time. As it turns out, click on everything that shouldn't be alive was a pretty flawless mechanic, made better through informative animations, good sound, and sizable weapon variety. But in light of where shooters are now, and where gaming in general exists as a medium, beyond the obvious innovations to technology and game feel, does Half-Life hold up? The answer is yes. Very much yes. Astonishingly, and to my great surprise, this game holds up. Even in the face of everything I'm objectively supposed to be annoyed at, Half-Life is as enjoyable as I assume it was 23 years ago because of the truly unique way in which the narrative is defined by its gameplay. Of course, narrative is more than just the content of the story, it's how the story is told, and with video games in particular, how player input drives that story. Video games are unique in that their narratives can work in conjunction with how the player experiences the mechanics. To unpack this esoteric conversation, think back to my earlier joke about first-person shooters. As it turns out, click on everything that shouldn't be alive was a pretty flawless mechanic. It's a decent joke because of how it reduces the experience of Half-Life to a simple interface. Move the mouse, click the mouse button, kill something.
God, what are you doing?
But games are more than their simple interfaces. Clicking a mouse takes on more meaning when, for example, a gun is placed between the player and the action. The player sees the gun and understands that their character is, or must quickly become, comfortable with killing. Hold a medkit, wrench, or Aperture Science handheld portal device, and the narrative changes. It doesn't just end with what's in my hand either. The setting, dialogue, and interactive objects all change how the player perceives the world. Half-Life and other Valve games are revered because they build stories around those little narratives players imagine while playing. For example, the train ride at the beginning is pretty stifling and uninteresting. The technology Valve were showing off at the time has long since been surpassed, by Valve, but the narrative intent remains intact. This segment doesn't feel fun because it's a commute. Gordon Freeman is going to work inside a massive underground facility. At some point in the long ride, you may even wonder how deep this complex goes, a thought that only adds to the exposition. Entire wings of this research center house projects and scientific objectives that he'll never know about, many of which are above his clearance level anyway. Players naturally assume the role of a research associate going to work for his specific study, allowing the rest of the facility to remain outside his purview. This is true to working in a research environment. These places house information you are simply not privileged to. This opening establishes the essential theme of the game: grounding, being grounded, immersing oneself in a relatable sense of normalcy. It's not perfectly realistic, but it is familiar enough to anyone who has worked in an office. Gordon isn't wandering a castle or scouring the depths of hell. He's getting ready for work, another day in his normal routine. Sadly, Gordon is destined for bigger things, and the well-established normalcy becomes the lens through which he perceives the cataclysmic upending of his once quaint existence. Gordon miraculously survives the explosion and makes a haunting climb out of the test chamber. The once productive halls of the anomalous materials lab are now a cacophonous mess of destruction and carnage. The resonance cascade has punched a hole through the laws of conventional physics and sent over some nasty creatures as a result. The iconic headcrabs make their debut by zombifying the science staff, a terror you can really empathize with since the game hasn't given you a proper weapon yet. Not to dismiss the iconic crowbar of the Half-Life series, but the reason it's so emblematic of Gordon Freeman is not because it's a weapon, it's because it's a tool. The crowbar is for smashing windows, opening crates, and getting into air vents, a thinking man's means of solving problems. You're not a knight with a warhammer, you're a terrified scientist clinging for dear life to something heavy. After all, defending the lab isn't supposed to be your job. You only managed to get a gun by pulling it off a guard's corpse. This is what people point to when extolling the narrative successes of Half-Life. It's not just the events of the story, it's how the gameplay and level design build a foundational mood players can gravitate toward, before rapidly changing that mood and asking players how they feel about being forced to adapt. It's a tightly choreographed manipulation of our emotions that still manages to feel so organic. Office Complex is an important example of this kind of design. The layout of the workspace is clear, and the normal path through is fairly obvious. You've seen an office before, right? Only the destruction incurred by the resonance cascade messed the place up, forcing Freeman to crawl on desks and inside air ducts to make any progress. Sure, winding and circuitous paths were common for Metroidvanias, and contemporary shooters were chock full of hidden treasures and branching levels. The design itself isn't new, but the narrative context is. The crumbling architecture gives the level a sense of improvisation. The cramped vents and structurally precarious holes are abnormal places to be in an office. But the clever scientist used his mental and physical agility to turn those spaces into new paths. So it doesn't matter if you recognize the planned linearity, because your emotional response to the story takes precedent. You just survived an explosion, and now you're thinking on your feet in a place that was once recognizable but no longer is. I think the way this level is framed actually makes the player feel smarter. You're not just stumbling around a plainly laid out level, looking for a corridor you haven't tried yet. You're jumping through cracks in the walls, taking a risk on a suspicious opening, and getting rewarded for your attention. It's like the dopamine hit that comes from finding a secret, only as a feature of the intended progression. And you better enjoy it while you can, because the military is about to drop in and ruin your day. Now, objectively, I know that the military aren't coming to rescue the scientists. They're here to kill us and prevent any Black Mesa research from getting to the surface, but I'm always quietly hoping that this time they do save us.
Hey, what the hell are you doing down here? Get topside! I hear troops are coming in to save us.
I guess it's because finishing Office Complex leaves me riding a high off my skill and cleverness. At that point, I've navigated the environmental puzzles, and I've gotten better at keeping my colleagues alive. Little successes amidst the many failures makes me feel optimistic. Sadly, We've Got Hostiles is a swift reminder of how much worse things will get for Mr. Freeman. It's from this point forward that the player probably starts marveling at the sheer size of the Black Mesa campus, if only because every nook and cranny seems to house some turret trap, sniper pit, or alien attacker. That's about when the player starts to wrap their head around the combat. See, all this focus on puzzles and narrative investment didn't actually detract from the raw fun of the gameplay. FPS essentials are still just as fun today as they were 23 years ago, so just take a moment to appreciate it all. Anything that can't be killed with simple bullets needs something with a bigger punch. Have you tried using a jet engine? What about a power grid? But seriously, I love how the Tentacle and Gargantua function as both bosses and level hazards early on. These set-piece fights highlight Freeman's ingenuity and escalate the challenge without relying on bullet sponge enemies. You even get a second chance to lure a Gargantua into a trap, because a giant killer crab is no match for a big brain. And airstrikes. The next level is On a Rail. It's generally considered by the fanbase to be one of the bad Half-Life levels, one of the sections you tolerate to get to the good stuff. As such, this seems like a good place to review the parts of Half-Life that haven't aged quite as well. I mean, in 23 years, it's bound to happen. One of the more reviled elements of the game is the platforming. See, Gordon Freeman basically runs at a full sprint, but he jumps more or less like an actual human. It's hard to gauge the exact length of a jump, and compensating for an overextended leap can leave you accidentally running off the platform you wanted to land on. Some are nice enough to halt your momentum with objects to collide into, but don't get used to that. Modern first-person games have worked really hard to improve the precision of their platforming, so getting the hang of Half-Life's entails a lot of death and embarrassment. Another quirk to the platforming involves the crouch jump. In other words, pressing the crouch button at the peak of your jump to reach ledges that are too tall for the regular jump. It's meant to simulate the act of tucking your legs as you jump. The trick is that almost every ledge requires a crouch jump to reach, which makes me wonder why they didn't just program a regular jump that went higher. I mean, Freeman can run full speed straight up a ladder, so clearly realism is a flexible goal. Speaking of ladders, they can get stressful. Going up a ladder is fairly straightforward, but you're not locked into the model when you move. As you climb, if you move too far left or too far right, you risk falling off, like it's some kind of vertical balance beam. Going down a ladder is practically a leap of faith, as you walk yourself over a ledge and hope you catch the rungs before falling to the ground. It's really the only reliable strategy. Free fall, then quickly save yourself. These are awkward elements, sure, but with enough time and practice, you can get used to them. The gimmick levels, on the other hand, are purposely designed to rip players from their comfort zone. On-a-rails cart is less like an actual vehicle and more like a vestigial limb. Freeman doesn't control the thing directly, he just sets the speed and lets the cart go. Moving forward becomes this suspenseful tango of managing speed, finding safe stopping points, and killing nearby hostiles. I have a hard time calling this a bad level because it so masterfully elicits its intended effect. Driving that clumsy wagon through a cramped railway system, always worrying about the next ambush around the corner, keeps the tension high. You're left paranoid and anxious about getting lost, while the rail car threatens to get you killed if you aren't cautious. But with such a long level, even well-crafted atmosphere can get old. Despite my praise, I'm always least excited to replay this part. But once the train ride from the doldrums is over, Half-Life can get back to its subtle storytelling. Having ridden the train far away from the anomalous materials lab where Freeman usually works, he's starting to discover the fantastic breadth of scientific research that had previously been withheld from his attention. Low security clearance and all. If he, like the player, spent his commute wondering what else went on at Black Mesa, then these next few levels would reveal some pretty dirty secrets. Within the formerly inaccessible regions of the research complex, Freeman catches glimpses of the experiments conducted above his pay grade. Apprehension and residue processing, on top of just being fun levels, foreshadow his boss's prior knowledge of the aliens. Nothing will force this suspicion onto you, but it might not be a coincidence that the vicious ichthyosaur just happens to appear in the same room as the aquatic observation and defense equipment. I know I personally got similar vibes after going through the bowels of Black Mesa while in residue processing. Now, I'm not an engineer, plumber, or other waste management specialist, but this seems like a lot of harmful runoff even for a facility with an anti-mass spectrometer. This much byproduct suggests the presence of some very powerful machines. Just what kind of scientific discoveries would require this much cleanup? Well, the kind with questionable ethics. Turns out that all these vats, incinerators, and pulverizers lay below the equipment needed to run tests on alien life forms, the portal technology that brought them here, and the advanced weaponry the military wants to fight them with. Researchers at Black Mesa clearly knew about the aliens before their attack, and have been secretly trying to replicate the teleportation methods needed to reach the alien home planet. I felt pretty annoyed at my superiors for provoking what they couldn't control. It also explains why the military were so quick to purge the scientists, too. See, instead of recruiting linguists, astronomers, or other diplomacy-minded professionals, the physicists at Black Mesa spent their time reverse engineering intergalactic portals and developing weapons that blow up if you don't use them properly.
Don't let it overcharge.
What do you mean, overcharge?
Imagine the embarrassment if the world just saw how badly the military and the government screwed up their first contact with an alien civilization. It's during surface tension when the player sees the full scope of the poop tornado bearing down on Black Mesa. The military and the alien forces have been duking it out on the complex for several hours, steadily escalating their assaults. If you're smart and really lucky, then you can let these two factions kill each other before running in to blast the survivors. Otherwise, making yourself seen means fighting a war on two fronts, outmanned and significantly outgunned. As if the ground forces weren't enough, for the first half of the mission, a helicopter stalks Freeman from above. See, you've made quite the impression as the one scientist who refuses to give up. You've been fighting back, outsmarting their traps, and killing their buddies. Narratively, the constant harassment from the chopper can't help but feel personal. Mechanically, it becomes the implied ticking clock that turns every encounter into a puzzle. How can Freeman best survive squads, tentacles, cliffsides, and minefields before frantically scrambling to his next hiding place? While it's easy to feel constrained by these circumstances, you'll soon see that each encounter provides some flexibility. Hiding spots transition seamlessly into flanking maneuvers. What at first feels like a precarious drop can quickly turn into a sneak attack. And sometimes, that little hole you crawl into for a moment's rest has a laser-targeted missile launcher. In case you thought that helicopter was going to survive a grudge match with Gordon goddamn missile launching Freeman, son! Surface tension is one of the longest missions in the game, partly because it was designed that way, and partly because I became obsessed with perfecting my very favorite route through the chaos. You see all the ways you could have done better, and the obsessive attention to each fight just leaves everything that much more memorable. It all culminates in a showdown between you and a second Gargantua as you turn military hardware against the Chitin Titan. You know, in theory. Half-Life's AI can get awkward sometimes, especially during the scripted moments. Sometimes you have to notice what should have happened and then prod it into happening. But since Valve are one of the first developers to do this kind of stuff in a video game, they get a pass. Forget About Freeman feels like a cinematic, high-octane reward for surviving surface tension with your sanity intact. If the last level was about staying on your toes to eke out a close victory, then this level is about triumphantly forcing your enemies into a retreat. The military can't beat you, the aliens can't beat you, and you get to prove that in the most awesome ways possible. Freeman spends the rest of this level carving a path to the surviving scientists in the Lambda reactor and teleportation labs. Of course, Lambda Core still has tough combat encounters, crafty environmental puzzles, and amusing platforming, but the real treat comes from the narrative closure. Freeman started this game relegated to one particular corner of the facility, but throughout his adventure, he's gained both knowledge and acclaim. Now, having proven himself far more competent than his supervisors, he's brought fully on board to be a part of the solution. Or clean up their messes, depending on how angry you are at them for sucking so much. Fighting back against the alien and military invaders has made Freeman an essential staff member. He's a keystone figure behind humanity's final push to the alien homeworld, Zen. Zen, Gonarch's Lair, Interloper, Nihilanthe. 4 levels on the planet Zen make up the most infamous section of Half-Life, dragging players across dimensions to hop on space rocks, scour treacherous caves, and fight through congested corridors rubbed a lot of players the wrong way. Between the frustration and the time commitment, much of the Half-Life fandom regards Zen as the rushed, flawed conclusion to an otherwise fantastic game. And they're all completely wrong. These levels rule. But hey, I'm not beyond reason. I see why almost everyone hates these levels. Jumping onto floating platforms is obnoxious. We learned the long jump technique late in the game, which is largely regarded as a game design no-no, and the alien combat sequences were branded as varying flavors of suck. Long, difficult, boring, you name it. I don't disagree with these arguments, but none of them detract from the game because they're congruent with what my Half-Life experience has been up to this point. After getting used to the crouch jump, the long jump wasn't much worse. Pressing Control Space isn't more confusing than pressing Space Control. And yeah, trying to jump on a series of moving rocks was definitely annoying, but not more annoying than any other platforming in the rest of the game. Landing on a moving target just felt like a natural escalation of the core challenge. Sure, it's frustrating, but it's a frustration I'd gotten used to by virtue of playing Half-Life for this long. Then there's the combat, which, yeah, maybe this sucks on hard difficulty when every enemy has double their base HP. A non-stop procession of spongy bad guys can get aggravating, but I've played Half-Life twice on normal to make this video and I had a blast each time. The Gonarch fight relishes in the fun of offloading heavy ordnance, even if I hate how easily the mini-crabs can pin me into a corner. After that, it's fun to get surprised by a third Gargantua, blasting it with satchel charges and missiles. It's a great reminder of how far Freeman's come now that he can blow these creatures into jambalaya with the contents of his backpack. No more running and hiding. And as far as the halls of Interloper are concerned, this was just a non-stop action gauntlet. I saved up my revolver, shotgun, crossbow, and noob tube ammo, so the whole thing was just a fast-paced shooting gallery. I'm not saying that these levels were perfect, it's just that after hearing so many Half-Life fans harp on how bad they were, I was expecting something much worse. But no, Zen feels like the out-of-this-world conclusion to the mechanics and narratives Half-Life had been exploring this whole time. Escalating shootouts, puzzles, and platforming challenges, buoyed by themes of scientific ethics, political conspiracy, and getting pulled into circumstances bigger than you can imagine. The only design decision I question is the Nihilith boss fight. I only beat this big baby after I looked up how beforehand. I don't feel bad though. Half-Life to this day remains a staggering landmark in game design, its age almost entirely offset by its storytelling innovations and general timelessness. Valve came out swinging with a title that changed how people interacted with first-person shooters and with game narratives at large. A story that unfolds as it's played, rewarding narrative curiosity with surprising emotional resonance and tantalizing lore implications. While there absolutely are clumsy elements that the players must acclimate themselves to, the core ambitions remain intact, and the fun still persists. Of course, people in my age bracket are likely to have fonder memories of Half-Life 2, the acclaimed sequel and Valve's bold experiment with facial animations, physics engines, and more humanistic writing. I'm sure its praise was earned back in 2004, but it hasn't been 2004 for many years. A lot has changed about narrative-driven shooters in that time, and it's therefore worth asking, does Half-Life 2 hold up? Well, I don't know. Ask me again in a few months. Like and subscribe.